those of you who don't remember where we stopped, well, we finished chapter 7 the last time that we met. So tonight we're going to be starting in chapter 8, which means we're coming to the end of the story. Because chapters 8 and 9 are all about the waters receding to the point that Noah and his family and also the animals are going to be able to disembark from the ark and begin populating the earth again. So go ahead and turn with me to chapter 8, verse number 1. I was hoping to be able to finish chapter 8 and most of chapter 9, but we're going to make it to verse 14, which I decided that's still going to be a victory. Verse number 1. And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. Now, I want you to underline the word assuage. That's probably not a word that many of you use very often, is it? In fact, you're probably looking at it and saying, how do you pronounce that? Well, that's the way you do. Assuaged is translated from the Hebrew word shakak, which means to decrease or to subside. So what this is saying is that the water stopped rising, and at this point, they began receding. Now, if you remember, it was 150 days after the rain began before the flood water actually started receding, before it actually started going down. And at that point, when it did crest, the highest mountain was 22 feet underwater. The highest mountain on the earth was 22 and a half feet underwater. But verse number 1 says that God remembered Noah. Now, of course, God had not forgotten about Noah or his family or the animals on the ark. So when it says that God remembered Noah, we have to realize that this is a Hebrewism. It's a figure of speech. In fact, this is a very common figure of speech in the Old Testament. And if you're reading through the Old Testament, you're going to come upon this quite frequently. And it's almost going to be like, wow, you mean God forgot about them? No. What this figure of speech really means is that God is taking specific action on behalf of that person or that group. Now, let me give you some examples so you'll get a feel for what this figure of speech means. All right? Look with me, if you would, in the book of Genesis chapter 19, verse number 29. And it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain. What were the cities of the plain? Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities that were around that. Very rich cities, I might add. It says, and it came to pass when God destroyed the cities of the plain that God remembered Abraham. And he sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelt. In other words, God took specific action on Abraham's behalf, and he removed Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah before he destroyed those cities. Now, turn to Genesis chapter 30, verse number 22. It says, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened up her womb. In other words, God took specific action on behalf of Rachel, and he opened up her womb to allow her to have children. It doesn't mean that God forgot about her up until that point. It simply means that God took specific action on her behalf. Am I cutting out? Or is that just me? Okay, I'm not. Good. All right, let's look at one more. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Exodus chapter 2, verse number 24. It says, and God heard their groaning. Who's groaning? The children of Israel when they were in Egypt. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. In other words, God took specific action, and he delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt because he had made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he did this on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's behalf. So when it says that God remembered Noah, it doesn't mean that God had forgotten about Noah. And then all of a sudden, Noah just popped back in his mind. And he said, oh no, I forgot about Noah. What am I going to do? No, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that God took specific action on Noah's behalf, and he made the waters recede so that there would be dry land. Now, most of you are probably thinking, well, why did God have to do that? It does that naturally. When the Illinois River crest, when there's a flood and it gets maybe 10, 15 feet above flood level. Anyone seen that happen? When I was going to JBU years ago, I commuted every day, and I was on my way home, and I got about a mile before you get to Hanging Rock. Do you know where Hanging Rock is? And the water was over Highway 10. Now, I was smart enough to know not to drive into the water. A lot of people are not smart enough to know that. But I had to turn around, and I had to go a different route to get back home. But I want you to understand something. We know that after the Illinois River crest, give it 3 or 4 days and it will come back down naturally. But this says that God remembered Noah. In other words, God's going to take specific action on Noah's behalf and make the waters recede so that there will be dry land. Now, I want you to think about this. If there's so much water that it covers every mountain on the earth, and there is no dry land anywhere. In fact, there is so much water that even the tallest mountain on the earth is 22.5 feet underwater. How are you going to get rid of all of that excess water so you can have some dry land? Where's it going to go? The whole earth is covered, people. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Do you comprehend the problem here? The rain actually came from a canopy of water that had previously surrounded the earth. Remember, you had this canopy of water that surrounded the earth when God was creating the earth. How many of you remember that? When God first created the earth, it says that water surrounded the earth. But in order for it to be able to be conducive to sustain life, God was going to have to create an atmosphere. So what did God do? God came in, and it tells us in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. In fact, go ahead and turn there. It's not going to come up here. I just want you guys to see this. Oh, I hope I can read this without my glasses. Go ahead and turn there. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." Now remember what that word firmament means in the Hebrew. It means space, but more specifically, a space of air. So God said, let there be a firmament that divides the waters from the waters. And in verse 7 he says, "And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so." So what he did was, he actually created a space of air that divided, can you see that? The waters that surrounded the earth, and there were waters above the earth, and this water was in the form of a water canopy. And that's why they lived so long on the earth before the flood. But if you remember, I told you that when the floods began, where did it come from? Where did all that water come from? It came from this water canopy. When it began to rain, all of the rain came from this canopy of water that surrounded the earth and created this global greenhouse. Remember, it didn't matter where you were on the earth, you had this constant temperature. Everything was green. There were no polar ice caps. There was no diversity of weather. It was always nice. It didn't even rain before the flood. That's why they thought Noah was crazy. And the reason it didn't rain is because you didn't have this condensation. Everything was here, so therefore you didn't have any of this wind. So any of the water that evaporated from the oceans, if it rained on the ocean. It didn't come across the land. There was no wind to actually even push it. So you had this. Now, remember, as we're going through the days of creation, God created land to come. And so what he did is he pushed out mountains. And as he pushed out mountains on the earth and there were valleys, this water that was here came to the point where 71%, actually probably a little less than that back then, because today it's about 71% of the earth is covered with water. But before that time, this water then came in and you had dry land, but you still had this water canopy. So in Noah's day, when the flood came, what took place? All of this water that was here turned to rain. And it rained for 40 days and 40 nights everywhere on the earth without ever stopping. And today that's physically impossible. It can't happen. But it could happen back then because of this water canopy that Genesis told us in chapter 1. And we didn't really realize it was even scientifically possible until the last 120 years. But everything the Bible said, we found out, is scientifically possible, and it's the only way that it could have happened. So let's think about this water. when this water canopy turns to rain, it now comes upon the earth. All of these little mountains that have been formed, guess what? It doesn't matter, because now, all of a sudden, this is now filled back up and everything is covered. What are you going to do with all that water? Where are you going to get dry land? What's going to take place? Well, God remembered Noah. What's that figure of speech mean? It means that God is going to supernaturally act on Noah's behalf to create dry land, because even the tallest mountain on the earth by this point is covered with 22.5 feet of water above it. Wow. So God's going to specifically act on Noah's behalf to make the water recede and the land appear. And how's he going to do that? Well, Psalms chapter 104, verses 6 through 9 actually tells us how God did it, and he tells us when he did it. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Psalms, chapter 104, verses 6 through 9. Now, as we're turning there, let me ask you, does everyone understand the problem? There's so much water on the earth, there's no place for it to go. You can't evaporate enough of it to condense and come in. It's 22.5 feet above the tallest mountain. It can't happen enough, people. That's the problem. Has everyone got that? All right. So, turn to Psalms chapter 104, verses 6 through 9. You clothe the earth with floods of water. Exactly what we're talking about. This up here came in the form of rain, and boy, it was consumed with water. Let's go on. Water that covered even the mountains. At your command, the water fled. At the sound of your thunder, it hurried away. How did it recede at his word? Mountains rose and valleys sank to the levels that you decreed. Then you set a firm boundary for the sea so they would, now notice this phrase, never again. We're going to hear that again in chapter 9. God's going to make a covenant, and he's going to tell us, never again will God completely destroy the earth with a flood. We will have local floods. Yes, the Illinois River will flood. Yes, the Mississippi River will flood. Yes, Afghanistan's going to have a flood. Different places are going to have floods, but those are local floods. Never again will the whole world be flooded. This is what this is saying. Notice what it says. Then you set a firm boundary for the sea so they would never again cover the earth. So as these mountains began to emerge at God's command, it caused valleys to form, and actually land began to sink, and the water began to run into the valleys that were forming, so the water began receding at God's command. But it required a supernatural intervention by God. And that's what the phrase, "and God remembered Noah," means. God specifically acted on Noah's behalf and created a way for the waters to recede so there could be dry land. And our atmosphere today is completely different to the atmosphere they experienced before the flood. You didn't have the Arctic and the Antarctic like we have. You didn't have ice and snow and any of that. You didn't see the sun so clearly. It basically came through and it dissipated all of those different rays. And so you had this wonderful greenhouse effect that was there. But you need to understand, before that time, or I should say after that time, it's not like that ever again. It's never going to be that way. So God specifically acted on Noah's behalf, and he created a way for the waters to begin to recede so that there could be dry land. He made these mountains to emerge, and he allowed these valleys to sink, and so the water would begin to run off, and it would begin to flow to all of the lower portions of the earth. Now, when did the waters begin to recede? When did God command this to happen? When did he command the mountains to emerge? For a second time. He did this at creation. Remember on the third day, I believe it was the third day, land appeared. When did he do this? 151 days after the flood began. Remember, the flood water crested on the 150th day after the rain began. We know that because of chapter 7, verse number 24, but also because of verse number 3 in chapter 8. Look at verses 2 and 3. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned from off the earth continually. In other words, they're going to begin to go down. And it says, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. That kind of sums it up. That last sentence in verse number 3 is a synopsis of these two verses. Notice what it says. And after the end of the 150 days. Now remember, chapter 7, verse 24. The last verse in chapter 7 tells us that the waters prevailed to the 150th day. In other words, that was the day it crested. Here it tells us after the end of the 150 days. In other words, the 151st day, the waters were abated. I want you to underline the word abated. Abated is translated from the Hebrew word kaser, which means to decrease or to recede. So verse 3 specifically states that after 150 days on the ark, the flood water began to recede. But it still had a long ways to go before Noah and his family could disembark from the ark. In fact, time-wise, they weren't even halfway there. Oh my, that's right. Noah and his family were on the ark for 371 days. And as we go along, I'll explain how we know that. We're going to do a little math, and we'll be able to calculate exactly how long Noah was on the ark before he was able to get off. All right? But at this point in the story, the thing that I want you to know is they haven't even made it halfway, time-wise. They've only been on the ark for 151 days, and they're going to be on the ark for 371 days. My, they still have 220 days left on the ark. Now let's look at verses 4 and 5. And the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month upon the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. Now it's very important that he's giving us dates. Why is he giving us dates? Because we can calculate it. We can go in and we can calculate to the exact day how long Noah was on the ark. And remember, God has been good to us. We know exactly when the flood started and what year, what day, what month. We go from when Adam was created. And in Genesis chapter 5, in the genealogy of Noah, we're able to come in and look and count it all the way to the point that Noah was born in the year 1056. Is that right? I'm doing that off of memory. And in the year that he turned 600 is when the flood came. So the flood began in 1656 years after Adam was created. Now I'm going to throw you for a loop here, people. But we'll be able to calculate exactly the year when Abraham came and God began to move in his life from the time Adam was created. We're going to be able to, and if you guys want to, when we finish the book of Genesis, I might do a little lesson on the chronology of the Old Testament. I'll be able to take you all the way to the year that the Exodus occurred. We can then trace things back. Now, you need to understand something. From the Bible's point of view in the Old Testament, it's going to reckon the date two ways. It's going to reckon the date from the time Adam was created, and it's going to work this way. But we don't do our calendar dates that way, do we? We actually go from Christ's birth, well, not actually his birth, but that point somewhere in there, and we go backwards, and then from that we go forwards. But you see, from Adam, when he was created, the Bible's going forward. But we can actually come in, and we can look and see that, well, the Babylonian captivity, the third captivity where they took them in and they destroyed the temple, happened in 586 BC. But we can actually able to calculate this all the way from when Adam was created and go boom, 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 boom. Why? Because God is specific in the Bible. You're thinking, why in the world is this important? Because I'm here to tell you. We are the generation that's going to see the Lord return. I don't think it's going to be in the next year or two, but I believe that I won't reach the age of 76 because of numerology. And if you were here in the book of Revelation, you understand the concept of the cosmic week, we're going to find out that basically if we look on the Jewish calendar and then convert it over to our calendar, Adam was actually created somewhere around the year 4004. And then we're able to come in and see when Christ returned and go 2,000 years from that, and we're in the 6th day getting ready to go into the 6th cosmic day in a cosmic week, which means that Christ is ready to return very quickly. And when you study numerology, I'm here to tell you God is very specific, and I'll tell you how specific. We're not even going to cover this tonight. But it's going to tell us exactly when the ark rested, and guess what? It's on the very day that Christ was resurrected. Oh yeah, on the 17th day of the 7th month. And when we convert that over to the Jewish calendar when they started from the Exodus and convert that over, it's going to be the 14th day of Nisan. 3 days later, he's resurrected. 17th day, 2nd month. God is very, very specific, people. I want you to understand that. And so we're coming through and we're calculating all of this, and most of you are thinking, why in the world is he doing that? Because I want you to understand something. This is a supernatural book. And you've got some idiots. I don't know how you pronounce his name. Is it Bill Maher or Bill Maher or whatever? And he's done some of those movies on ridiculous faith or whatever it's called. The guy's an idiot. They don't understand the Bible, and so they read the Bible and they can't pick out these things. But anyone who truly studies the Word of God, it fits like a glove to the point that it's scary. Okay, I'm going off here. But right now, Noah's only been on the ark at the point we are 151 days. But he is going to be on the ark for 371 days. Now look at verses 4 and 5. And the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month upon the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. In other words, we know exactly when you started seeing the tip of the mountains, but it still hadn't gotten down to the valleys. Notice that the ark rested on the 7th month on the 7th day. In other words, the waters receded enough for the hull of the ark to actually touch land, and it lodged there. Underline the word rest. It's translated from the Hebrew word nuach, which means to set down and remain fixed. Now, the Bible actually tells us where the ark rested. Look back at verse number 4. And the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month upon the mountains of Ararat. It rested upon the mountains of Ararat. That's a mountainous region in what is now Armenia. It's close to the border of eastern Turkey and Iran. Let me show you a picture of that area so you'll kind of know where we're at. Go ahead and pop that up if you don't mind. Now, this is the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, this is Israel right here. This is Jordan. Now here's Egypt. Right here, Syria, Iraq. This is Iran. Here we have the Caspian Sea. Is it really a sea? Trivia question. No, it's not a sea because it doesn't empty into an ocean. It's not connected to an ocean. We still call it the Caspian Sea because it's so big. But anyways, it's called the Caspian Sea. Here's the Black Sea. Notice this is Turkey. Right there is Armenia. Does that make sense? Right there is this mountainous region known as the mountains of Ararat. All right? Now, verse 5 tells us that it was 74 days before the tops of other mountains could be seen. And I'll explain the math later. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the dates because God is very specific on the dates. He tells us when he entered the ark. He tells us whenever all these things happen. And all we have to do is kind of add up the dates and we can see it. But right now I just want you to look at verse 5 again. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. So the ark had to have rested on the highest mountain in the area if the other mountaintops weren't visible until 2.5 months later. Does that make sense? Now, you can imagine this. You're in the ark, and all of a sudden you feel this joke. We hit something big. We're no longer moving. It's nuach. It's been set in place, and it's remained fixed. So what's the first thing you're going to do? You've hit something. You're going to climb up the ladder. Remember the Claire story of windows that's all around here with this roof on it. You're going to look outside, but all you can see is water, but you hit something. So every day you're noticing, it looks like the water's going down. Well, it tells us that on the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. Now we're starting to see the tops of the mountains. Now, because you couldn't see the mountains when you first lodged or you actually ran aground. Most scholars believe that the ark rested on what is now known as Mount Ararat. Here's an aerial picture of Mount Ararat. Go ahead and look up there. The first one's going to be a wide shot because I want you to be able to picture things. Everyone understand that that's Africa? Oh yeah, there's America. There's South America. Notice how this is going to fit together. Ever seen that? That's kind of neat. Did you notice that? When we get to the Tower of Babel, we're going to explain why it does that. Okay? The Bible talks about that. Did you know that? Oh yeah. We'll get to that when we get to Peleg. But anyways, here's Africa. Egypt's right here. This is Saudi Arabia. Here's Israel. There's Turkey. That's the Black Sea. That's the Caspian Sea. See that little white dot between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea right there? That white dot? That's Mount Ararat. Now that's a wide shot. Just want you to see where it's at. Now let's go a little bit closer. If I had my computer here, we would just kind of scroll in with a computer program. But right now we're getting a little bit closer. So here's the Mediterranean Sea, Saudi Arabia, Red Sea here. There's the Gulf of Aqaba. That's really beautiful water. But anyways, children of Israel crossed through here. They came to Mount Sinai there, but I'm getting off. That's the Black Sea up here. Here's the Caspian Sea. See that little white dot right there? That's Mount Ararat. Let's zero in now. Let's go to the highest mountain, Mount Ararat now. That is Mount Ararat. That's the topography of it. It is the tallest mountain in the mountains of Ararat. Does that make sense? So we kind of know where the ark supposedly went. I shouldn't say suppose, where the Bible says that it went. Now, let me show you some recent aerial pictures of what could possibly be the ark on Mount Ararat. How many of you have heard of the pictures? Yeah. Well, this first picture is taken by the U.S. Air Force in 1949. Go ahead and show that. See that right here? What does that look like? Kind of looks like a ship, doesn't it? And actually, it's falling apart. Actually, there's the tip of it, but it goes all the way down to here. That's how big it was, and it's kind of fallen in. Now, let's go to the second one. This is still 1949. We're seeing this point here, and we're seeing the three prongs out here. Go to the next one. This is where it's located, right up here. Sometimes as the ice slowly is beginning to recede, we're starting to see more and more supposedly of this. Now, I'm not saying this is it. I'm just showing you what they're flying over and showing. Now, let me show you a picture that's taken by our Air Force, United States Air Force. Not one of those banana republics. Someone made it up and put it on Google. This is 2003 U.S. Air Force. Go ahead and put that up there. That's what it looks like now. Can you see that? So, if we're coming in and saying it did go on the highest mountain, now it doesn't mean that it did. It just tells us that it lodged in this area and that you couldn't, when it did lodge, you couldn't see the other mountaintops for 74 more days. Does that make sense? And then by that time you should see it. So we surmise that it was the highest mountain, which would have been this mountain. And we see this structure that's there that supposedly, and there's always people in that area, so they climbed up there and it was wood, petrified. But anyways, now let's go on to verses 6 and 7. And it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. This is a different word for window than the windows of the clear story. Actually, this is a Hebrew word that means hatch. He had this little hatch that he opened up. All right? And he sent forth the raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters were dried up from off the earth. So, after 40 days, because verse 6 says at the end of 40 days, after 40 days, Noah opened up a window and he sent a raven out. Now, there's two things that I want you to notice in these verses. First of all, Noah sent a raven out 40 days after the mountaintops could be seen. So, let's look at a chart on the back wall. All right, you have this chart on the back of your handout. If you notice, it says the rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. It crested at 150 days. Chapter 7, verse number 24 tells us. So 110 days later, add 40 to 110, at 150 days the waters crested. The waters began decreasing at 150 days, but it didn't go to the point where you could see the mountaintops until, and he gives us the date. He tells us on the 17th day of the 7th month. So we add 13 days to that to get 30. Because in the ancient Jewish calendar, The way they would actually come in and do the dates or do the months was 30 days in each month. And I'll explain how they could then catch up, because every 6 years they add a month in, and if you don't understand the Jewish calendar, that's why people get screwed up. But anyways, so now we come in and we find out that here it was, 13 days takes to the 8th month, and then it was the 10th month on the first day. So we have the 8th month, 30 days, the 9th month, 30 days, and on the first day of the 10th month, which is, add those up, 74 days. So at 74 days, we got 40 and 110 is 150. After the waters begin to go down on the 74th day, you could see the mountaintops. Now, 40 days after you could see the mountaintops, Noah opens up this hatch, and he sends out a raven. Which brings me to the second thing that I want you to notice. He sent a raven out. Why in the world did he send a raven out the first time? Because we're going to read a little bit further, and he's going to send out doves 3 more times. But why in the world did he send a raven out instead of a dove? Does anyone know? There you go. It's because the raven is a carrion bird. Does everyone know what the word carrion means? Carrion actually means rotting flesh of dead animals. So a carrion bird is a bird that eats dead flesh, just like a vulture does. Now, as a carrion bird, a raven doesn't have to live in the lower areas where trees and plants grow. They can live higher up on the mountaintops as long as there's animals there that have died. Wow. So it can live anywhere that there's dead meat. And in this case, as the waters were going down, a lot of the dead bodies that had been floating on the water, humans and animals, would come to rest on these exposed mountaintops. So when the raven didn't come back, it told Noah that the raven had found dry land to rest on, and he was finding food. But it didn't tell Noah if plants and trees had started to grow back. And in order to find that out, what's he going to have to do? He's going to have to start sending out doves, because doves are not carrion birds. So they have to live either in valleys or lower lying areas where trees and plants grow that produce the fruit that they need. Now, at first, when he sent the raven out, it says it came back and forth, but eventually, and we're going to surmise 4 or 5 days later, it didn't come back. So Noah knew that the water was continuing to recede and more land was being exposed, but he didn't know if the land in the lower regions was dry or not, and if plants and trees were beginning to grow. And to know that, the only way he can find out is to send out doves, which takes us to verses 8 through 12. Let's read verses 8 through 12. Also we sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot. And she returned unto him into the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Then he put forth his hand and took her and pulled her into the ark. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came into him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and he sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him any more. Now, 7 days after he first sent the raven out, he sent a dove out. Now, when you're first reading the story, you don't realize that it was 7 days after he first sent the raven out that he sent the dove out. Why? Because verse number 8 simply says that he sent a dove out. Look at verse 8 again. Also, we sent forth the dove from him to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. So, when you're first reading this, it sounds like he sent a raven out and he also sent a dove out. But when you keep reading and look at the details, you find out that verse 10 tells us that he sent the dove 7 days after he sent the first raven. Or he only sent one raven, but he sent the raven out. Look at verse 10. And he stayed yet another 7 days. See the word another? He stayed yet another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. It says again. Now, notice that word another. That tells us that Noah waited 7 days after he first sent the raven out before he sent the dove out. So when the dove came back that day, he waited another 7 days, and then he sent the second dove out, because that's what verse 10 says, and that's how we know he sent the raven out 40 days after. He sent the first day 7 days after the raven went out. He sent the second dove out 7 days after that. He sent the third dove out 7 days after the second dove. Now, the second dove brought back an olive leaf in his mouth, which told Noah that trees were beginning to grow again in the lower areas. Look back at verse 10 and 11. Let's read this in context. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. This is the second dove, not the third, the second dove. That's why that another was so important. And the dove came into him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. But it didn't stay. It brought it back to the ark. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off of the earth, but it didn't have a place for it to land, so it came back to the ark. So that still didn't mean that the earth was yet habitable. Right? Everyone with me so far? Because the dove came back to the ark instead of remaining free. So 7 days later, Noah sent out the third dove. Look at verse 12. And he stayed yet another 7 days, and he sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him any more. This time, the dove didn't return, which meant that the dove had found a place to nest with plenty of food. But that still didn't mean that it was safe for Noah and his family and the rest of the animals to come back at the ark, or to come out of the ark. I want you to look at the chart again. Take a look at your chart. When he sent the third day out, he had been on the ark for how many days? Basically, we come in and we add 40, 110, 74, 47, 7, 7. Up to this point, we have been 285 days on the ark. My gosh. Do you have cabin fever yet? Look at verses 13 and 14. And it came to pass, notice the details, in the 601st year, Noah is now turned 601. So it's the next year. In the first month, the first day of the month of that year, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark. And he looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. Still doesn't get off the ark. And in the second month, on the 7th and the 20th day of the month, was the earth dried. Now, remember, Noah and his family boarded the ark on the 17th day on the second month in the year that Noah turned 600. We found that out in chapter 7. Do you want me to give you that date again? It was the 17th day of the second month in the year that Noah turned 600. The year 1656 from the day that Adam was created. And he removed a portion of the roof so he could climb up on top of the ark on the first day of the first month of the next year. Look at verse number 13 again. Notice what it was saying. And it says, and the waters were dried up, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked. You see, that's what it means when it says that he removed the covering of the ark. What he did was he removed a portion of the roof. Why? Because the water's below and he's not quite sure and it's a long ways down. This is a high ark. He could have climbed up the clear story to get up on top, but he said, no, that's too dangerous. I'm 601 years old. So he tears off a portion of the roof. It's what it means when it says he took off the covering of the ark. He tore out a portion of the ark because it's not raining anymore. And if it starts again, well, we're just tearing out a little piece. And he climbs up on top of the ark so he can look down. Wow. All right. Now again, when did he do that? Well, he tells us specifically. He did that on the first month of the first day of the next year, that year that Noah turned 601. So if he entered the ark on the 17th day of the second month, that means that he was on the ark 314 days when he tore a portion of the roof off and climbed on top of the roof to look out. Now again, let me explain something to all of you who are great at math. The ancient Jewish calendar only had 30 days in a month. And to keep things right, what they would do, in fact, it's kind of interesting, is when you're studying through the Old Testament, you have to understand this, and they did this by when the harvest came. They would be able to determine whether they needed to add an extra month or not. But anyways, that keep the seasons right. But to keep things right, they added an extra month to the calendar about every 6 years. So again, if you add up all of the days that Noah had been on the ark, up to the day that he sent the third dove out, which he's told us all of these. Each time he gave us these dates. It rained 40 days and 40 nights on the 150th day. So for 110 days more, the waters finally crested on the 150th day. It was 74 days before you could see the top of the mountains. After 40 days that you could see the top of the mountains, then he sent a raven out 7 days after that. He sent the raven out, 40 days after you could see the top of the mountain. And then 7 days after he sent the raven out, he sent the first dove out, came back. So he sent the dove out 7 days after the first dove. It came back. So he sent it out the third day, and guess what? That's 285. So we can come in and look at the date, subtract all of that, 314 days. That's when he tore the roof off. We subtract 285 from that. That's when he sent the third dove off. And guess what? It was 29 days before he looked down and he said, boy, guess what? It's dry. Wow. So 29 days after he sent the third dove out, Noah climbed up on top of the ark and he looked out and he saw all of the flood water is gone. The earth is dry. But Noah and his family and all of the animals wait another 57 days. Would that not be driving you crazy? Why, if the earth was dry, did they not come out? Because even though the flood water was gone, it was still not safe because the ground was soft and it was muddy. Now, how do I know that? Pastor Allen, how do you know that? Because I know certain Hebrew words. I know that because the Hebrew word for dry, and also that little phrase in verse 13, dried up in verse 13, is different than the Hebrew word for dried up in verse 14. Totally different. Totally different root words. They're not even similar. Look at verses 13 and 14 again. And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up. Underline that phrase. From off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark. In other words, he tore out a portion of the roof. And he climbed up on the roof and he looked down. And behold, the first face of the ground was dry. See that word dry? That word dry and that phrase dried up in verse 13, same Hebrew word. Verse 14. And in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dried. That word dried is totally different. A totally different Hebrew word. In verse 13, dry is translated from the Hebrew word karab, which means free from surface water. There was no water on the land, the surface of the land. In verse 14, the phrase dried up is translated from the Hebrew word yabesh, which means completely dry. So even though the flood water had completely drained away, when Noah tore off a portion of the ark, climbed up on the roof and looked down, the ground was still soft and muddy. And it took another 57 days before the earth was completely dry and the ground was hard enough for Noah and the animals to come out of the ark. So look at the chart one more time. We can actually take all of these days, we can add them all the way up, and on the 371st day. Now here's what's interesting. Even though Noah saw it through the doves, sent the raven out, sent 3 doves out, and then he tears a portion of the roof off, looks up, gets up on the ark and looks down. Guess what? He still won't come out until when? We don't have time. We're going to see this next week. Until God speaks to him. And God told Noah, come out. That is so sweet. But it's also a lesson for us. Because God wants us to use our physical senses many times. He wanted Noah to send the raven out. He wanted Noah to send the doves out. He wanted Noah to climb up on the roof and look out and go, boy, God, see, it's dry. And I'm sure he was talking to God. We're tired of being in this thing. It's over a year. It's 371 days. Can we not get out of here? And God said, I know it looks that way. I'm glad you did that. I want you to see, but wait. And he didn't leave until God told him, till he knew it's time to come out. And that's what we're going to look at next week. And then we're going to see the covenant that God makes with Noah that still applies today.